Today in Jewish History project was started in 2018. First, we were just an Amazon Alexa skill, then a podcast. Social media posting followed, and then a WhatsApp group. Today in Jewish History gets over 30,000 monthly consumptions. And now it's time to bring it into book form. The cost of bringing a Jewish book to publication is quite a significant one. That's why if you ever look at the beginning of any Jewish book, there's many dedications and sponsorships because the costs are tremendous to make a book happen. We are now bringing the money together to bring Today Jewish History into book form, and I hope that we can count on your sponsorship. Please consider sponsoring one day on the Jewish calendar for $180, or maybe an entire month for $1,800. I look forward to having you work with me on this project to inspire people around the world with the timeless lessons of Jewish history. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I'm your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in and study some Jewish history together. So the Yom Kippur War, while in the end was a victory for the Israelis, spawned a very tough time for the Jewish people worldwide. First of all, the 3,000 Israelis killed in the army in the first few days where Israel was essentially losing the war, literally shook up Israeli politics at home. Even though in the end there was a victory, everyone wanted to know how was it that the Israeli army, which had been so successful in its first three wars, all of a sudden was caught off guard, the sneak attack, seemingly unprepared, and people wanted answers. So even though you had the people who were literally the founders of the country, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, the heroes, well, they now, because of this one situation of the Yom Kippur War, become fallen heroes in the Israeli government. And after, there will be an investigation called the Agranat Commission, named after the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, who was the head of the commission. And they had a number of findings as to, there was some questions of how the army responds to the government, how the government deals with the army. Golda Meir was actually completely exonerated in the commission, was not blamed at all for anything that happened in the war. It was looked as if she had done as much as she could with the information that she had as prime minister. But be it as it may, the Israeli public wanted answers, and they wanted someone to blame. And so after the war, and the subsequent year, Golda Meir will resign from the government. Moshe Dayan will resign from the government, and a new wave, what was looked as the future of the Labour Party will come into power. Now, remember, at this point in Israel, there's no question of anyone being in power but Labour. They are still the majority, and they are still the ones able to form the coalition and the coalition parliamentary government that Israel has. We're going to see that's also going to change in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. But initially, Yitzchak Rabin comes into power, and he was looked at as really, like we said, the future of Mapai, of the Labour Party. Again, it's gone through different names. Nowadays, we call it doesn't really exist anymore, but when they did have power still, or were a force to reckon with in Israel, they were referred to as the Labour Party most recently. So, and Rabin, there's a lot of excitement around him. First of all, he was the first Sabra prime minister of Israel. He was the first one to be born in Israel who was serving as prime minister. His predecessors, Ben Gurion, Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir, were all foreign born, and he was actually born in Israel. And beyond that, he was the ambassador to the United States, so he had great, seemingly good relations with the United States of America. And people were very excited with his government and thought that even though there was this shakeup of the political system within Israel, it would still only be a shakeup within Labor, and Labor would remain in power, and a lot of the same policies would be in power, and everything would still be fine for the way the country is established as a semi-socialist but Western-leaning country. Now, the shakeup really was not just in Israel, it was worldwide. Because we mentioned last week that the Arab states, in response to the Yom Kippur War, even though you have to remember, unlike the Six-Day War, where there's at least an argument to be made that Israel started the war, not really, but they did fire the first shot in the war because of the sneak attack against Nasser. Nasser definitely provoked the war and prepared the war and made the war happen, and we definitely blame it on Nasser. But I can at least hear an argument that Israel did fire the first shot. But in the Yom Kippur War, Israel was 100% attacked. The belligerents were, the Egyptians came in, the Syrians came in, and we were just attacked from all sides. And the funny thing is that this war spawned more anti-Semitism in the world than the Six-Day War. After the Six-Day War, that change of relationship where David beats Goliath, I think everyone was just in shock worldwide. But in 73, where Israel was initially attacked, initially put down, and then fights back, that just sparks tremendous anti-Semitism, a tremendous wave of anti-Semitism in the world. A lot of that is because of the Arab oil embargo that affects people worldwide. It helps the economy, nearly crash in America. Inflation, for those of you who might remember from the 70s and into the early 80s, the ridiculously high inflation that existed in the United States of America at that time. If you weren't alive for it, don't remember it, don't worry, it's on its way back now. And that a lot of that was really sparked in response to the Arab-Israeli war, to the Yom Kippur War. Now, also the Cold War. That was really a high point for the Cold War. Throughout the entire Cold War, there were different levels of threat that America had for the situation. DEFCON 5 was like the Cold War, normal, whatever normal was during the Cold War, where we have our rockets, nuclear weapons facing Russia, and they have our nuclear weapons facing America, but everything was status quo. During the Yom Kippur War, it went to DEFCON 3, meaning that the threat level between the Americans and the Soviets had been raised, the highest I believe it was ever raised. I don't know if it ever, the highest at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think that was the highest it got. I don't think it got higher than 3 at any point for sure after the Yom Kippur War. And in that war, the Soviets had loaded ships heading to Egypt, and America had planes that they were loading heading to Israel. It was rough because what happened was, and we'll see this as a prelude for the aftermath of the war, that Sadat was really moving away from the Soviets. Even though all the weapons in Egypt were Soviet, all of the training was Soviet, in many ways he understood much better than Nasser did before him, and for sure Farouk before him, but he understood that they were pawns to the Soviets. He understood that they were being played to a certain extent by the Soviets, and he wanted to be in the American sphere of influence. So when the Soviets weren't making good on certain arms promises and certain things that they promised the Egyptians, even before the Yom Kippur War, Sadat kicks all the Soviets out of Egypt. So the Soviets during the Yom Kippur War were really trying to make up, patch up their relationship, because they understood Egypt was they were the Saudi Arabia of today. They were the power of the Arab world, and they realized that if Egypt would fall out of their sphere of influence, they could lose all the Arabs to the West. So the last thing that they wanted was Egypt to fall under the American sphere of influence. So that's why it was a shakeup in the world, and everyone knew it was because of the Jews, right? Everyone, this rise in the Cold War threat, the inflation, the oil prices, the gas prices. It was very easy to blame it all on the Jews. So there was waves of anti-Semitism that went around the world. And so, it's very rough in Israel this time, and it's kind of rough for the Jews worldwide. Don't forget, in Soviet Russia, there's still many, 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 many hundreds of thousands of Jews behind the Iron Curtain still, even though we mentioned that there was the trickle and the beginning of the Jews getting out throughout the 70s. It won't really happen en masse till the 80s, and then, completely after, obviously after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s. Coupled with this, was after the Yom Kippur War, the PLO becomes a recognized political body on the international stage. So it goes from being just a terrorist organization, that it is, but at least being recognized as a real player on the international stage. And in 1974, the PLO gets observer status in the United Nations with the passing of UN Resolution 3237, and they get observer status in the United Nations. And this part of this was was Arafat making his infamous speech in the UN, and where he stood up there and he had a gun in his holster in the United Nations, even though I think that was illegal. I don't know if it was loaded or not, but he made this statement where he said that he came with an olive branch in one hand and a gun in the other, and he warned not to let the olive branch fall from his hand. And then he continued to completely blast the concept of the Jewish state, blast any claims that the Jews had to our ancestral homeland in Israel, and this was all followed by a standing ovation by the United Nations General Assembly. So this was just the continuation of the really anti-Semitism within the United Nations that we've seen almost from its inception until today. But again, even though we all know what the UN is, it was a certain legitimization of the PLO that was a terrorist organization fighting the Jewish people in Israel. And that was not a good thing for the Jews worldwide. So Jews watching this and they see Arafat stand up and to be cheered on by the General Assembly and standing ovation and be treated as a freedom fighter, it was not good for the Jews. And that was the situation in the world in 1974. Now, as we go on through the 70s, which was, just truly a tumultuous decade, 1975 in the UN, probably one of the most anti-Semitic of the resolutions ever to be passed by the United Nations, was the infamous Zionism is racism resolution, which was passed, and it just that was the situation in up to 75. So if we look at the decade of the 70s, we have the Yom Kippur War in 73, followed by the rise in anti-Semitism, followed by in 74 and 75 a certain legitimization of the PLO, and the United Nations, the world body, saying, "Oh, Zionism, meaning the Jews' desire to have a home in its ancestral homeland, that's racism." That's where we're holding. 1976, the continued terrorist attacks happened throughout the world. One of the most infamous or famous ones of all time takes place on June 27, 1976, when a Air France Airbus A300 that was heading from Tel Aviv to Paris with 248 passengers was hijacked by two members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a PLO affiliated organization. The plane was hijacked after a stopover in Greece via Benghazi. They eventually land in Entebbe, Uganda. Now, the Ugandans were in on the scheme, and the hijackers and the terrorists were able to stay at the Entebbe airport with the protection of Idi Amin Yamach Shemo, the dictator of Uganda at that time, and he would come every day, show his support for the terrorists. There were Ugandan troops stationed around the airport hangar where the hostages were kept. So it was on one hand the PLO, but they were working very closely in tandem with the Ugandan government. Now, Uganda and Idi Amin and Yasser Arafat were very close. In fact, Yasser Arafat was the best man in one of Idi Amin's, 6 or 7 weddings that he had. The guy had like 60 kids from 10 wives or something like that, and or 10 women. I don't know if he married them all even. But Yasser Arafat was actually the best man in one of his weddings. So you see the close relationship between these two terrorists. Now, after the first 2 days of the situation, of the hostage situation, there were 148 non-Israelis, non-Jewish passengers were released and flown to Paris. Now, the terrorists also offered the crew, the Airbus crew the Air France crew to go with the passengers, but they said, even though they weren't Jewish, they said, no, we're staying with the Jewish passengers. So there were 94 mainly Israeli, but all Jewish passengers, because even non-Israelis who the terrorists thought were Jewish were kept. So 94 Jewish passengers and 12 crew members of the Air France crew were kept as hostages, and they were threatened with their death if there weren't the demand was certain Palestinian and Arab terrorists should be released. I think it was 40 or 50 or 60, I don't remember the exact number, but they should be released from jails in 3 different countries. So the situation is escalating, and once the hostages are threatened with death, the IDF jumps into action, the Mossad jumps into action, and a rescue a rescue attempt is planned where the Israeli transport planes carry 100 commandos over 2,500 miles from Israel to Uganda. On the map it might not look like it's very far, but 2,500 miles away, undetected by radar or by any allies that might tip it off to Uganda. And the rescue operation, to begin with, took a week of planning. And it lasts over 90 minutes. And they're able to land these cargo planes in the Entebbe airport. In one of the cargo planes, they had a Mercedes that, based on their intelligence, was a replica of the Mercedes that Idi Amin drove in. What they didn't know was that Amin had gotten a new Mercedes that week. The one they had was black, and he had gotten a new white one. So they were hoping that they could get all the way to the hangar without being detected, and the guards would think that it was just Amin and the Mercedes. But as the Mercedes was approaching the hangar, the two guards stopped them, and they were shot immediately with silencers. The Mercedes with the commandos proceeds on to the hangar, and at a certain point, the hangar had as an old airport. I'm calling it a hangar. It was an old airport building. It had a glass wall, like many airport buildings have, so you can see outside. And the Israeli troops are detected as they're pulling up, and the element of surprise is unfortunately compromised. And in the process, there's shooting that breaks out before the Israeli commandos ever enter the building. And one Israeli soldier, who's actually the head of the campaign, was shot by the name of Yonatan Netanyahu, the brother of soon-to-be and past Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu, and he falls. He's the one casualty of the Israeli army. Is Yonatan Netanyahu. But out of the 106 hostages, 102 are rescued. Unfortunately, 3 were killed. And early on in the crisis, there was an older lady, a 74-year-old Israeli-British citizen by the name of Dora Block, who had choked on a chicken bone. So she was taken to a hospital. And after the incident, she is brutally dragged from her hospital bed, much to the protest of the nurses and the doctors. And some of the doctors and nurses are actually killed in the process. And she's dragged out of the hospital. She's killed. She's dismembered, and she's thrown by a sugar patch, and her body is not recovered until after the fall of Amin several years later. I think it was 2 years later. Or 1 year, no, 4 years later, I think. Whatever it was, several years later. 5 Israeli commanders were wounded, but in the end, it was considered a tremendous success. The fact that these 102 were saved, but the casualties again were felt. The 3 hostages that fell, and the 4th of Ms. Block, and also Commander Netanyahu. But it was regarded as just an amazing hostage rescue, unmatched in the world until that point, and maybe unmatched since. But now, as part of the process, there were also 45 Ugandan soldiers that were killed, and 11 Soviet-built MiG-17s and MiG-21 aircrafts were also destroyed. The Israelis had destroyed all the military aircraft sitting on the ground at the beginning of the operation, so that the Ugandan Air Force couldn't chase their planes out as they left from Uganda. Now, Kenya, neighboring country in Africa, if you don't know where it is, actually supported the Israelis. And so in the aftermath, Idi Amin ordered all Kenyans in Uganda to be killed. He ordered he ordered attacks, tried to order attacks on the president of Kenya. And it was a bloody situation where about 245 Kenyans were killed and 3,000 ended up fleeing for their life. But again, it was definitely regarded as a major success, and really, the show of strength of what the IDF could really do and the Mossad could really do and what they could really achieve, and really the concept of the one of the pillars of the Jewish state is that a Jew anywhere in peril will not be left alone without the attempt of the Israeli government to save them. Now, interestingly enough, the date of the rescue was July 4th, 1976, which was the day of the bicentennial of the United States of America. So while America is celebrating the bicentennial, you have this amazing operation going on in Uganda and the saving of these hostages. 1977, Israel has elections, and it was the fall of the Labor Party, the fall of Mapai slash the alignment slash Labor, whatever they were called at any point in history. And again, people thought this would never happen. It was in 30 years in power, and people thought they would always be in power in Israeli politics. Now, what led to the fall of the Labor government? So, first of all, Rabin, even though there was so much hope around him, there was also there was definitely clouds of scandal, because when Rabin was the ambassador, it became known that he had earned basically a side income with speaking engagements, visiting bar mitzvahs and events or whatever it was, and he had basically a U.S. bank account where he had over $10,000 that he had earned while he was the ambassador to America. Now, $10,000 in the 70s is equal to about $55,000 today. Tomorrow it'll be equal to about $75,000 with inflation. Or maybe back to, I should go the other way, I should say. But anyways, be it as it may, this was illegal. This is illegal, in all countries, and especially Israel, that government officials cannot, or there's a very limited scope on the side income that government officials can earn. Government officials, for sure from America and Israel being the same, cannot be paid for appearances, for speaking engagements, etc. And here it was discovered that Rabin, during his tenure as the ambassador to the United States, had earned a nice side income, and that shrouded his premiership with that scandal, and it's going to lead to a tremendous internal battle within Labor going into the 1977 elections. Now, the battle is between Rabin and Peres, and Shimon Peres, and as they will, by the way, battle really until Rabin's assassination in 1994. 1995. But that battle went on for a very long time between Peres and Rabin. But you have, number one, that's one of the factors that leads to the fall of Labor. The second was that for the first 30 years of the country, the religious parties were always part of the government, aligned with Labor. They were part of the Labor coalition, and there was a situation where Israel took delivery of some special aircrafts from America, and they held a ceremony on a Friday night, and that enraged the religious community within Israel. They felt that, what is this, the Jewish state not respecting Shabbos, and therefore the religious parties dropped out of the coalition, forcing a vote of no confidence and forcing the elections to even come about in the first place. And so it was all this that really led to the rise of Menachem Begin. So again, the Labor Party having their own internal fighting, the scandal of Rabin, and then the coalition eventually follows with the support of the religious parties. Now, the religious parties will end up aligning themselves really from this point forward with the right-wing governments, as they've been in and out of power over the next 45 years from this point forward. Now, Menachem Begin is a fascinating personality. I'm a big Begin fan. I'll just say it straight out so you know where I'm coming from. One of the best books on Begin is the book Prime Ministers by Yehuda Avner. Great book, highly recommended. A lot about the prime ministers that preceded Begin as well, but it's mainly about Begin. And he was a fascinating character who at this point, for the first 30 years, out of the first 30 years of the state of Israel, for 20 of those years was the leader of the opposition. He was always in political no man's land. He was always a political outcast. Ben Gurion wouldn't even talk to him or address him by name in the Knesset. And Begin also Ben Gurion had like a strong line in the sand that that Cherut, which was the name of Begin's party in the early days before it became Gachal, before it became Likud, that the Begin's party would never be part of the government. There would never ever. Ben Gurion is famous for saying no Cherut or communist, that he would not have the Communist Party of Israel in his government. He would not have Cherut, the right-wing party, the Begin party, in his government, and he never did. There was as long as Ben Gurion was prime minister, they were never in the government. Now, in the prelude to the '67 war, and from '67 to '73, there was a unity government. So Begin was actually in the government for those 6 years, and he was a minister without portfolio in the prime minister's office, which meant he was in the not the kitchen, what they call the kitchen cabinet meetings, not the small cabinet, but in the bigger cabinet meetings. But again, didn't have much political clout, if you will. So having someone who, first of all, the tenacity to stay in politics for 30 years in that position is amazing in and of itself. But Begin, if we try to understand who he was a person totally driven by idealism. He was not a pragmatist. He was an idealist in all ways, shapes, and forms. He was somebody who was driven with 2,000 years of Jewish history behind him. He was driven by the horrors of the Holocaust behind him, and this is what he brought to every meeting. In fact, in his first meeting with Carter, as he's explaining the need for the Jewish state after 2,000 years of being in exile and the Holocaust and the pogroms and Khmelnytsky, etc., and he culminates by saying that our people were tertiated in World War II. And Carter stops and says, "What was that word?" He said, "Tertiated." He said in the Roman army, and in the time of the Roman Empire, they had the concept of being decimated, which was when they had an insubordinate battalion. They would kill 1/10 of the battalion to try and resubordinate them. That was the term decimation. People often think decimation means annihilation. No, decimation means killing 1/10. He said, therefore, our people were tertiated during World War II, meaning 1/3 of the Jewish people were annihilated in the Holocaust of World War II. And that just, that shows Begin. He had such a command over the English language, over every language. He was a tremendous orator. But like I said, at his core, he was an idealist, and he was religiously motivated. He was, I say this with a little bit of hesitation, but he was the frummest prime minister Israel has ever had. And yes, I know that the 2 prime ministers ago at this point, Naftali Bennett wore a yarmulke and a Shomer Shabbos. Yeah, well, we'll just leave it at that. But Begin was just driven by religious idealism. Even though he wasn't himself completely Shomer Shabbos, he was very carefully promised to Rav Aryeh Levin, one of the main rabbis in Israel at that time, that he would never be Machal Shabbos before Hesia, meaning he would never desecrate the Shabbos in public. And this manifests itself in some amazing ways. In one way, when Sadat, we're going to talk about in a minute, when Sadat came to visit Israel, he came in on a Saturday, but Begin said he couldn't land until Saturday night. So the plane circles over Israel. I mean, that was the plan always. So even though it arrived a little bit before Shabbos ended, it circled for an hour until Shabbos had ended, when they had the ceremony for Sadat in Israel. And then later, when Sadat is unfortunately assassinated, his funeral's on Shabbos. And Begin, against the advice of the Shin Bet, of the Israeli security, he not only attends the funeral, but he won't desecrate Shabbos publicly. So even though they wanted him to ride in an armored car, so that at least he'd have that safety, he wouldn't do it because that would be desecrating the Sabbath in public. So he insisted on walking from his hotel to the place where the funeral was, again surrounded by heavy Israeli security, and that just shows what kind of person Begin was. Now, there's the idea that we say in the Shabbos Zmiros of Ki Yishmeru Shabbos Kel Yishmereni, that for someone who watches Shabbos, Hashem will watch over them. So in that case, Begin was watching out for Shabbos, and Shabbos watched after him, and he got back and forth to the funeral safely. But that's Begin. He was religiously motivated. He would regularly quote from Tanakh, and even though he didn't wear yarmulke 24/7, he would always have a yarmulke in his pocket, so that when he quoted from Tanakh, whether it was from Psalms or elsewhere, he'd always take out the yarmulke, put it on his head, and then quote the psukim. He'd be giving speeches in the Knesset, speeches in Congress in America, in the United Nations, where he would quote these verses. He'd take out the yarmulke, put it on his head, and say the verses that he would quote from our Tanakh, from our Bible. So this is Menachem Begin, and he is able to, in the 1977 election. Now, his party had been gaining a lot of steam. Ariel Sharon, one of his deputies, had been advising certain coalitions, bringing together certain disenfranchise of the Israeli political system and the Israeli culture in general. So there are many parties that for a long time had been on the fringe of Israeli politics that they were able to bring into Likud. Now, the term Likud just means coalition. It was a coalition party. That's what it was. We think about today how it's such a monolithic party with Bibi at the head, but that's not how it started. It was a coalition of many disenfranchised parties within the Knesset, and Begin also reached out to many disenfranchised people, not the least of which was the Mizrahi Jews. That at this point, as we talked about before, there were well over 1 million Mizrahi Jews, I mean Sephardic, Iraqi, Iranian, dark-skinned. We as we said before, we often lump together every dark-skinned Jew as Sephardi, but it's not true. It's not true. There's a lot of different culture and a lot of different custom, a lot of different spin in these different groups, but we would call them Mizrahi Jews. That's sort of our umbrella term for the Eastern Jews, for the Jews from North Africa, the Jews from the Middle East, and the Mizrahi Jews had really been disenfranchised also throughout the first 30 years of the young state of Israel. I always like to quote the story of my dear friend Reuven Israeli, friend of our dear friends the Israelis. Father of our dear friends the Israelis, Rafi and Dina Israeli, and he always says that he's a Sephardi Jew, and he always says his friends are originally from Iraq. And he says that when I lived in Israel, I was black, and then I moved to America and I became white. And that's really what it was. That similar to how the African Americans, the blacks in America, have been disenfranchised for a long time, from definitely starting off as slaves and then through the civil rights of the 60s and on to today in many ways. But that's how the Sephardim were in Israel, and so Begin reaches out to them, and he strikes a chord with them because they're also a more traditional group, and they looked at how the left at this point had really just wasn't sensitive to many of the religious sensitivities of the religious community, and definitely wasn't sensitive to them, and they were kept as a token member of society, but not much more than that. And they will vote en masse for Likud and for Begin. So with this coalition, Begin is able to come to power, and one of the most amazing political coup d'etats. I mean, you can't even call it a coup d'etat because it was done completely legitimately, but people were just shocked because they thought Mapai would never fall, and here you have a government led by Menachem Begin. Now, this was the beginning of the end of socialism in Israel. Israel, like we said, was found as a semi-socialist state, and with Begin's coming to power, that will be the beginning of the end of it. Now, as far as it being a completely free economy, that really won't start until Netanyahu becomes the Minister of Finance in Sharon's government, not until the 90s. It'll be a long time before that transition happens, but it begins to definitely crumble in the 70s and on through the 80s and into the 90s. Today, there's a little socialism here and there. It's still socialized medicine. You still have a few kibbutzim around the country, but today most of the kibbutzim are commercialized. They're just really settlements where they have a business and they're making money, and they might be sharing the money to a certain extent, but it's not the socialist kibbutz of the of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. So this is really the beginning of the end of socialism for Israel. Now, one of the first major events that happens when Begin is prime minister is Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, visits Jerusalem. Now, the way that this happens, the way this comes about is through an interesting stroke of events. So Begin actually invited Sadat to come to Jerusalem in one of his speeches. Now, Begin was an amazing speaker, an amazing orator, and it could have been taken really as just prose that he was speaking, making this statement. But he said that we would love to have Sadat come to Israel, come to Jerusalem to speak with us with no preconditions. And Sadat also responds in a speech saying, "I'm going to go visit Begin in Jerusalem so we can talk with no preconditions." And it's like one of those things that no one really thought it would happen until it happened. Now, if we look at the situation, Sadat felt that the other Arabs were a lost cause. They weren't going to go anywhere. Nothing was going to happen. He wanted to move away, as we said, from the Soviet Union into the American sphere of influence, or more in the American sphere of influence. And he saw this as a way to do it. And it was really a radical move. I mean, from the day that Sadat announces he's going to go to Jerusalem, there's death threats. There's he's villainized recognized throughout the whole Arab world. All the other Arab leaders are furious with him. They feel that he's selling out the Jordanians, he's selling out the Syrians, he's selling out the Palestinians, and unfortunately, the time is ticking for his life at that point. But as we said, that Sadat comes in on a Saturday night. There's a whole entourage, a whole ceremony to greet him at Ben Gurion Airport. There were there was tremendous concern also because don't forget, this is the same Sadat that just attacked them 4 years earlier in the Yom Kippur War. So there was definitely the concern that the whole thing could be a trap, that in that Arab plane that was landing in Ben Gurion, that the doors could open. It could be Egyptian commandos behind the doors ready to shoot down the prime minister or the Knesset, because it was like, all the political leaders were gathered there to greet Sadat, and therefore Israel had snipers stationed all over the airport with their guns pointed to the plane, just in case if it was a trap, they'd be prepared for it. And sure enough, the plane opens, Sadat comes out, and he comes on, he greets the all Israeli leaders, past, present, future, or not future, but I'm sure there's some future. But Golda Meir was one of the first people he greeted, and Golda Meir says to him, "We've been waiting for you," in a very touching, grandmotherly way. And when he meets Ariel Sharon, the great commander of the Yom Kippur War, he says to him in a joking way, "If you step foot back in Egypt, I'm going to have you arrested." And to which Sharon responds, "Oh, don't worry, I'm just the Minister of Agriculture now. You don't have to worry about me." And by the way, as Minister of Agriculture, he spawns the quote-unquote settlements built throughout Judea and Samaria as part of agriculture. But anyways, they greet and everything seems friendly, and they take him to Yad Vashem. They take him around the country, and he's allowed to. He goes to the Dome of the Rock in the old city, and he prays at the Dome of the Rock. Now, mind you, that one of the previous Arab leaders that had at least sent overtures of peace to Israel was the king of Jordan, who was assassinated when he came out of the Dome of the Rock, when it was controlled by Jordan, because he had spoken to the Israelis, right? But Sadat goes, luckily comes out safely at that point, and finally he gets to the Knesset, and he makes a speech in the Knesset, and he says that he's come in peace, but he basically lays out an agenda that he will stick to for a very long time. And the agenda is not just that this should be about Egypt and Israel making peace. It should be about Israel making peace with all the Arab neighbors brokered by Egypt, and that to do that, Israel has to go back to its pre-67 borders. It has to withdraw from Sinai. It has to withdraw from Judea and Samaria, aka the West Bank. It has to leave Israel. It has to leave Jerusalem. It has to leave the Golan Heights. At which point, Begin was not very happy, to say the least, when he made the speech. He turned to Moshe Dayan, who was the Minister of Defense in his government, and he says to him, "We need to prepare for war." And he actually gets up to give the rebuttal, where he basically says, "We're not going anywhere. We're not withdrawing. We're not leaving Jerusalem. We're not leaving the Sinai. It's just security. These are all security concerns. And thank you very much, Mr. President, for coming." So a meeting that was looked at with so much promise and so much excitement, it almost looks like it was dead on arrival, and not much happens. Now, in enters a very unlikely player in this puzzle of Middle East peace, and that is none other than Jimmy Carter, who was President of the United States, elected in 1976, from Plains, Georgia. Now, that's not Atlanta, Georgia. That's Plains, Georgia is some backwater hick part of the great state of Georgia, where I come from. Not Plains, but Georgia. And here, somehow, through again a strange path of events, he becomes a president of the United States, and he's also a Southern Baptist. He's a religious Southern Baptist, and he's motivated with his involvement in the Middle East really by religious fervor, that he sees it as his religious duty to make peace in the Middle East. And therefore, when he sees that nothing comes of Sadat's visit to Jerusalem, that Sadat has drawn his line in the sand and Begin has drawn his lines in the sand, he intervenes. And he invites both Sadat and Begin to Camp David. Now, Camp David's interesting that Carter himself, when he became president of the United States, he had this philosophy around the presidency called citizen president. In other words, he didn't want his presidency, it all looked like a monarchy, like many presidencies had before him. He sells the presidential yacht. He insists on carrying his own bags, and he wanted to sell Camp David until he realized that the bunkers and the command center, and how if the whole government, if the American government ever come under attack, the whole government could be run by from Camp David, and he also falls in love with the place as a retreat. And he and his wife Rosalind decide that maybe if they can get Sadat and Begin sort of out of their environment with just a few of their advisors in a secluded area for a couple of days, maybe it can break the stalemate, and maybe something can happen. So on September 5th, 1978, Sadat and his entourage, together with Begin and his entourage, and Carter and much of his entourage, come to Camp David to try and broker a deal. Now, initially, Carter's plan was just to be the mediator. He was not going to put forth any plan. He was not going to push anything down either Begin or Sadat's throat. But what happens is the entrenchment of both men carries throughout the first number of days of the time that they were at Camp David. Sadat comes with a whole plan, which again talked about how Israel had to completely withdraw from Sinai, had to withdraw from the West Bank, had to withdraw from the Golan, had to withdraw from Jerusalem, etc., etc., etc. And Begin, lock, stock, and barrel, rejects everything. He says, we're not leaving Sinai, we're not leaving Jerusalem, we're not leaving the West Bank, and we're not leaving the Golan. And that's honestly how it went for the first number of days. Back and forth, they tried to have meetings, and it got to the point where Sadat was starting to crack and starting to make certain concessions, and certain, he was kind of moving away from the other Arab questions of the Golan and the West Bank and Jerusalem, and he was starting to crack, but Begin wouldn't move, wouldn't budge a bit. The actual turning point was kind of interesting, that looking just for a break in the impasse, Carter takes both delegations to Gettysburg, which is not far from Camp David, and with his own knowledge of history, gives a tour of Gettysburg, talking about the Civil War that America faced, and really like the backdrop of that starts to sort of, seems to kind of resonate with Sadat and Begin both. They finally get back to Camp David, and everything's still a stalemate. At which point Carter says, okay, me being a mediator hasn't worked. I'm going to have to put forth a plan. And finally, the Americans come with a plan that basically takes the Golan Heights off the table, takes the West Bank off the table, doesn't say much about Jerusalem that UN Resolution 242 didn't say. And it really, really just came down to Israel would have to withdraw from Sinai. Now, Begin, as a campaign promise, had said, "I will go out of office on the Sinai Peninsula." In other words, when I retire from the Knesset, I will do so in the Sinai Peninsula. Saying, a way of saying that Israel was never going to give back to Sinai. He saw it again, not like the rest of Israel, where he was biblically motivated, right? Judea and Samaria, he was biblically motivated. He said that's part of ancestral Israel. Jordan, he was biblically motivated because that was Aver Yarden. That was where two and a half tribes of Israel lived during the first temple time period. That's biblically motivated. Sinai was not biblically motivated. That was security motivated. That was motivated by security concerns. But still, he said, we're never leaving there. We can't afford it. And the way he finally budged on that was he said, we'll leave it as a question for the Knesset. In other words, he wouldn't be the one giving up Sinai, so to speak. He agreed at Camp David for the question to be presented at the Knesset, and sure enough, it was, and the Knesset voted to withdraw from Sinai, which was done. It was a 5-year process before Israel withdraws from Sinai, and really because of giving that, once he was ready to budge on that, that was enough for Israel and Egypt to sign the Camp David Accords. Now, it was a cold peace from day one, and it's remained a cold peace until today, yet it is still a peace. There is diplomatic relations between both countries. There has not been a direct act of war since then, and Sinai has returned completely to the Egyptians. The Straits of Tiran, which was always the area that was always of concern, that was being closed to Israeli shipping, as well as the Suez Canal for everybody else, but that has not become an issue since '77, and in the end, it's interesting that Begin and Sadat, even though they were, they were not in the we'll say the best of relations at Camp David, they're actually able to form a close friendship in the end. So much so that, like we said, when Sadat is eventually assassinated, Begin insists on going to the funeral, even on Shabbos and even walking. Now, this is an interesting, lesson, if you will, to the other Arab leaders. Now you have the king of Jordan, you have the president of Egypt, who've both, one just sent overtures to Israel, one signs a peace treaty with Israel, and both are shot dead. It's not going to help the peace process too much by saying that if you talk to the Israelis, we're going to kill you. But that's the situation after the Camp David Accords. Now it's interesting. I just want to point this out. It's kind of funny that in Begin's delegation there are many names that we know, many famous names in Israeli politics. Moshe Dayan was there, and Ezer Weizmann was there, and a lot of names that we all recognize for those of us who know Israeli politics. But let's face it, most of us don't know Egyptian politics too well, and there's not many names we would recognize in the Egyptian delegation, which is fine because Sadat was a complete autocrat. Even though he was president, he was made president for life, prime minister, everything, and he was still, it was a one-man government, really under his leadership, but still he did have a delegation, and one of the people in his delegation was none other than Boutros Ghali. Now, Boutros Ghali, we know, was later in the 90s, became the Secretary General of the United Nations, but he was actually from Egypt. He was a Christian, actually, and that's one of the reasons he would never rise to high levels of Egyptian government, because he was Christian, but he was actually part of the Camp David delegation, and later became the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, I've always found it interesting that if you look at the, 7 or 8 or 9 UN Secretary Generals that the UN has had since its inception, there are always no names from small to middle powers. And I used to be like, why is that? It doesn't make so much sense. You would think that it should be, it should always be someone from the US, then Russia, then France, then China. Those should be the people who are leading the United Nations. But it's actually the way that the Secretary General gets picked is it gets put forth, the candidate gets put forth by the Security Council to the General Assembly, and then the General Assembly votes. And therefore, to even put a candidate forward, because don't forget, in the Security Council, all 5 of the permanent members have a veto power, have a veto vote, and therefore it's usually the names for Secretary General come about through a lot of compromise, through a lot of backroom dealings, and like I said, it ended up being someone from a small to middle-sized country, usually of no political fame before they come to power. And by the way, I think they also have to have a great name. Like Boutros Ghali is just one of many great names. I mean, there's Yu Thant, there's Try Give Lie. I mean, there's so many great names. Kofi Annan. I mean, that's the one thing. You got to have a great name. That's, I think, the one thing they require to become the Secretary General of the UN. But again, interesting. The Boutros Ghali, before he became Secretary General, was there at Camp David. Okay, so in 1981, Begin is reelected in the Knesset, and Ariel Sharon, his Minister of Defense at this time, insist on finally doing away with the PLO once and for all. Now, the PLO, if you'll recall from previous sessions, they were originally stationed, so to speak, in Lebanon. After the 1970 civil war between the PLO and Lebanon, they are exiled to they're originally in Jordan, and after the 1970 civil war between the PLO and Jordan, they're exiled to Lebanon, and they've just continued their terrorist attacks from Lebanon. So, encouraged by Sharon, Begin wants to once and for all do away with the PLO, and to this end, he will invade Lebanon in what we know as the First Lebanon War. Now, the pretext for this, there's plenty of pretext. The PLO, made it very easy to justify such a thing. They shot the Israeli ambassador in London. They had been continuously shooting Katyusha rockets from Lebanon into the Golan and the Galilee, and therefore Begin wanted to once and for all destroy the PLO. Now, what happens is the First Lebanon War is I think what we call a military win and a strategic loss, or a military win and a diplomatic loss, because initially Israel achieves their objectives. They get all the way to Beirut. They destroy all of the PLO camps throughout Lebanon. They exile the PLO from Lebanon to Tripoli and Tunis with Yasser Arafat. So they have to relocate. To with much more distance to Israel, and they helped to install a pro-Israeli Christian government that was led by a man by the name of Bachir Gemayel, and at that point, Begin says that we're going to sign a peace treaty with Lebanon, and it's going to bring 40 years of peace. So that's what happens towards the beginning of the war. But what becomes clear is these allies, these Falange Christian allies, well, they weren't such good allies. They ended up themselves massacring a number of the Palestinians, not even members of the PLO, just refugees living in Lebanon, to which Ariel Sharon is blamed for not having stopped that, and Sharon will actually be forced to resign. And in the end, a war that started with so much hope and the promise of 40 years of peace, and it would look like we'd finally do away with the PLO once and for all. It ends really as a like we said, a diplomatic loss. Israel will withdraw from Lebanon, and the unrest in Lebanon will still exist for many, many, many more years, and it's looked as a definite failure. Now, after this time, Eliza Begin, Menachem Begin's wife, passes away. So the combination of the failed Lebanon war and the loss of his beloved wife throws Begin into a state of depression, and eventually he tells one of his closest advisors, he says, "I just can't do it anymore," and he resigns from the government. And basically goes into seclusion for the rest of his life, and to the point where no one he's I think never seen publicly again. Only one of his closest advisors even has contact with him, and that's unfortunately how this great hero ends his life. Now, what's interesting is after Begin's government, for the next number of years, there's a unity government made up of President Shamir, and that will really take us through the duration of the 80s, which will be an interesting situation. And that will ultimately culminate with the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu and the rise of Likud as a powerful force in Israel, and that's what we will discuss next week. Now, next week will be our last installment of the Jewish Destiny series, because we're already now up to things that I remember from my lifetime, and that was always my rule of thumb with history. If I lived through it, it's not history, but it is history. So we will next week we'll cover the end of the 80s, the 90s, up until present times, and then the following week, we will begin the Jewish Personality series. It'll be our new series starting, in which we will focus on different people throughout Jewish history, and each session will be a biographical snapshot of great personalities in Jewish history. I look forward to doing that with you. I look forward to just studying with you and discussing it with you. And in the meantime, I wish you all a great week. We'll see you next week, and then God willing in 2 weeks for the kickoff of the new series. Everyone have a wonderful evening.